Okay, here is the rewritten paragraph, following your instructions. Imagine a typical day. You wake up feeling calm, maybe even a sense of peace settles over you as you start your morning. But, as the day unfolds, the demands, expectations, and opinions of others start to subtly creep into your thoughts. Before you even realize it, you begin to compromise, to adjust, to negotiate that happiness that felt so completely yours when you first woke up. Sound familiar? Many of us over 40 experience this daily, and it's easy to let external forces dictate our inner state. Today, let's delve into how, through the timeless wisdom of Buddhist principles, you can cultivate a happiness that becomes truly non-negotiable. This is about creating a state of being that no one, and nothing, can take away from you. But first, do me a favor, if you like what you are hearing so far, please like and subscribe to the Wisdom and Wealth channel. This will help you get more content on your journey toward a more peaceful life. Chapter 1: The Importance of Inner Peace. To truly understand why making your happiness non-negotiable is so critical, we first need to grasp what it truly means to have inner peace. From a Buddhist perspective, inner peace isn't just a fleeting feeling of calm. It's a deep, abiding state of tranquility that arises when our mind is balanced, free from the desires, distractions, and attachments that often lead to suffering. This kind of peace is the very core of true happiness, a happiness that doesn't depend on external circumstances or the approval of others. Imagine a lamp shining brightly in a dark room. That lamp represents your inner peace, and its light is constant and warm. However, every time we allow external opinions or our own insecurities to take over our mind, it's as if someone is placing a veil or a curtain in front of that lamp. Gradually, the light grows dimmer, and our inner space darkens. This darkness is what we feel when we let external influences take control. What we need is to learn how to keep that inner space illuminated, to protect that peace at the very center of our being. This is essential to get to that place where the feeling of a non-negotiable state of mind and peace lives. The Buddha taught that true happiness comes from freeing ourselves from the desires and expectations that bind us to suffering. In his discourse on the Four Noble Truths, the Buddha explained that suffering is an inevitable part of life. However, he also made it clear that the root cause of this suffering isn't the circumstances themselves, but rather our relationship with them, how we allow those circumstances to impact our mental peace. When we understand this fundamental truth, we realize that protecting our inner peace is our personal responsibility, and ultimately, the key to lasting happiness. Are you finding this valuable so far? Please like and subscribe to the Wisdom and Wealth channel. It really helps other people find this content. To cultivate this inner peace, it's essential to develop the ability to observe our emotions and thoughts without letting them carry us away. The practice of mindfulness, which has deep roots in Buddhism, invites us to be present in each moment, to see reality as it is, without judging or resisting it. By practicing mindfulness, we learn to observe how certain thoughts or feelings disrupt our peace, how our own expectations and desires, or even those of others, create waves of unrest in our minds. To illustrate this, picture your mind as a calm, still lake. When you allow the words, criticisms, or demands of others to affect your state, it's as if a stone has been thrown into that lake. Waves form, and the water's clarity becomes clouded. But, if you decide to protect that lake, if you choose not to allow anything external to disturb its surface, the water remains calm and clear, reflecting sunlight purely. This is the mind at peace, a mind unaffected by external factors, staying in a state of calm and clarity, and it is what we are all looking for to achieve a non-negotiable sense of peace. Maintaining inner peace isn't a selfish act. On the contrary, it's an act of profound responsibility. When we have peace within, we radiate calm and stability to those around us. We become people who inspire serenity rather than anxiety. Those around us, without even realizing it, also benefit from our stability, from our ability to remain unaffected by external storms. In Buddhism, this is called upekkha, or equanimity. Equanimity is the ability to stay calm amidst chaos, to not let either pleasure or pain sweep us away. It's a quality that we can all develop, and that helps us see life with greater clarity and compassion. Additionally, inner peace allows us to connect with our true nature, with the essence of who we are beyond what others may think or the labels that society imposes on us. This connection with oneself is fundamental to living an authentic and fulfilling life. When we are at peace, we can act from our essence, from what we truly are and desire, rather than from a place of insecurity or a need for acceptance. This is what Buddhism teaches us, that true happiness, the kind that doesn't shatter or fade, arises when we live in coherence with our essence, without letting anyone or anything alter it. Okay, we are halfway there. Remember, we are building a community of like-minded folks here at Wisdom and Wealth, so be sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Finally, to cultivate this inner peace and make our happiness non-negotiable, we need to be mindful of what we allow into our mind. Just as we care for our body by feeding it healthy food, we must be selective about what we let into our mind. What thoughts are we feeding? What emotions are we allowing to take root and stay? Rather than letting negative thoughts, doubts, or insecurities contaminate our inner space, we can choose to nourish ourselves with thoughts that strengthen our peace, with practices of gratitude and compassion that elevate us. Every choice we make, every time we decide not to get caught up in negative thoughts or emotions, we are cultivating that inner peace. In summary, inner peace is the foundation of our happiness, and protecting it is an act of self-love and responsibility. By understanding and applying these principles, we can begin to see happiness as something non-negotiable, something that doesn't depend on what happens outside or on what others think of us. As we cultivate that peace and learn to observe our emotions without judging or being swept away by them, we become stronger, more stable, and our happiness turns into something solid and deep, something that truly belongs to us. Chapter 2: Identifying the Sources of Suffering. Once we understand the importance of inner peace, the next step is to identify what elements in our lives are undermining that peace, and therefore our happiness. From a Buddhist perspective, suffering isn't simply physical or emotional pain. It encompasses anything that generates restlessness, dissatisfaction, or anxiety. To protect our happiness and make it non-negotiable, we need to recognize the sources of suffering that we allow into our minds and hearts. The Buddha taught that suffering mainly arises from three roots: desire, hatred, and ignorance, known as the three poisons. These poisons cloud our minds, and when we don't identify them, they lead us into behaviors that compromise our peace. Desire isn't only about wanting material things. It also refers to attachment to outcomes and the expectations we have about how things should be. When we live with rigid expectations, every time something doesn't go as we planned, we feel that something is missing, and this sense of lack leads us to suffer. A common example is when we rely on others' approval to feel happy. If we base our self-worth on what others think of us, every criticism, every negative comment, or even an indifferent gesture becomes a source of suffering. We feel vulnerable, as if our happiness were in other people's hands. But, when we identify this need for approval as a source of suffering, we can begin to question it and work on our emotional independence. We can ask ourselves, why do I feel the need for others' approval to be happy? What's preventing me from feeling whole on my own? Another major source of suffering is hatred or aversion, which manifests as rejection toward people, situations, or even parts of ourselves. Every time we feel hatred or rejection, our mind fills with tension and resentment, stealing our peace. Sometimes hatred arises as an automatic response to situations we don't understand or that make us uncomfortable. For example, if someone at work receives more recognition than we do, it's easy to fall into resentment and comparison, creating unnecessary suffering. But, if we identify this reaction, if we observe how hatred or envy manifests in our mind, we can begin to free ourselves from its control. Instead of viewing others as threats, we can see them as opportunities for reflection and growth. The third root of suffering is ignorance, the inability to see reality as it is. Often, suffering arises because we cling to illusions, ideas, or concepts that pull us away from the true nature of things. For instance, we might believe that if we have a bigger house, a better job, or an ideal relationship, we'll be happy forever. However, this is an illusory view, as everything in life is impermanent and constantly changing. Buddhism teaches us to see reality clearly, to accept that nothing is permanent, and that happiness doesn't depend on external conditions but on how we choose to respond to those conditions. Identifying sources of suffering also means observing behavioral patterns and relationships that affect our inner peace. Ask yourself, what situations or people create the most stress and anxiety in my life? Are certain commitments, expectations, or interactions undermining my happiness? Sometimes we live trapped in relationships or environments that drain us emotionally, and we feel powerless to change them. However, Buddhism invites us to take responsibility for our well-being, to recognize that we can establish healthy boundaries and distance ourselves from situations or people that constantly bring suffering into our lives. For example, imagine you have a friend who constantly criticizes your decisions, who judges your achievements or your mistakes. That constant criticism can slowly erode your self-esteem and tranquility. Identifying this relationship as a source of suffering doesn't mean you should immediately cut all ties. But it does mean you need to be aware of how that interaction affects your peace. From this awareness, you can make choices that protect your happiness, such as setting clear boundaries or, if necessary, creating some distance. By identifying sources of suffering, we also uncover the roots of our unhappiness within our own minds. How often are we our own worst critics? How often do we let our own doubts and fears pull us into discouragement? One of Buddhism's deepest teachings is that often we ourselves generate our suffering by not clearly observing our own thoughts. If we can identify these patterns, if we can see that our expectations, attachments, and rejections are the sources of our pain, we can begin to dismantle that suffering at its root. Lastly, it's important to remember that the purpose of identifying sources of suffering isn't to blame ourselves or feel bad about them, but to understand them in order to transform them. Buddhist practice invites us to observe our thoughts and emotions with compassion, without judgment. By doing this, we develop a greater understanding of ourselves and take a step closer to inner peace. It's not about eliminating suffering entirely, as it's part of the human experience, but about reducing its impact on our lives by observing it with clarity and wisdom. In summary, identifying the sources of suffering is an act of self-understanding and self-love. It allows us to see clearly what's affecting our inner peace and gives us the power to make choices that protect our happiness. By observing our reactions, expectations, and attachments, we can begin to build a life where our happiness is truly non-negotiable, a life where we don't allow anything or anyone, not even ourselves, to compromise our peace. Well, that's about all the time we have for today. Before you go, please like and subscribe to the Wisdom and Wealth channel. Also, please leave comments below for any of the topics you'd like us to address.